In this video, we'll be looking at polling, a technique which has recently become very popular in education. My name is Mark Pegram, and I'll be taking you through this material. And here's the usual copyright notice that you see at the start of all of the online videos. Why would you want to poll students? Well, here are a few suggestions from the Poll Everywhere service. It can support adaptive learning in lecture halls. It allows a teacher or a lecturer to get a good sense of what students have understood and to get a sense of what questions they still have. You could be brainstorming with a small group of people or a very large group of people. Polling can be a way of structuring small discussions, but also large discussions. And of course, it can be about classroom quizzes, which in turn can feed back into adaptive learning. Where would you poll students? Well, again, here are a few suggestions from the Poll Everywhere service. Services like this allow people to participate by using a web browser on a desktop or laptop computer, or they can participate using an app on a mobile device. Poll Everywhere, in fact, also works through Twitter, so often there are many options for getting people involved. Here's a quote from a recent academic article looking at the advantages of having a polling back channel in a lecture context. You might like to pause the video in order to read this more closely. And here's another recent quote from another recent study, which comes to a similar conclusion about the use of polling in a lecture context. This particular study focused on the use of the Mentimeter polling service accessed on students' own mobile devices. Again, feel free to pause the video to read it more closely. Let's get down to the mechanics of polling. Originally, if you wanted to conduct polling in a class or a lecture, you needed quite expensive equipment, referred to as an audience response system or a personal response system, or simply known as clickers. Actually, the term clicker refers to the device that you can see the woman in this picture holding in her hand. As you went into class, you would be given a device like this. At some point, the presenter would pose a question, often a multiple choice question, and you would key in your input. So in other words, you would key in your response. This is the kind of equipment that we often still see used in television game shows. As you can see here, the responses would be displayed on a screen at the front of the room. As I've mentioned already, the real problem here is that this kind of equipment is quite expensive. But nowadays, there are lots of free or almost free options in the form of Web 2.0 software and mobile apps that students can access on their own devices. Mentimeter, the polling service I mentioned a moment ago, is one example of such a service. So, let's have a look at some examples of these kinds of services. We're going to trace a kind of history of polling, starting with the older services and working our way up to the newer services. It's worth mentioning that many of these work on a freemium model, where you have a basic level of functionality available for free, but you may need to pay for additional functionality or additional numbers of users or additional privacy controls, for example. MicroPoll is a great service for setting up web-based polling questions. As you can see in the example here, you type in your text in the question box. This happens to refer to Istanbul because it was prepared for a seminar that I ran there recently. And in the box underneath, with answers, you put in the possible responses. MicroPoll then generates a multiple choice question like you can see on the right. You can get the embed code for this widget, and it means that you can then embed this polling question on your web page, on your wiki, on your blog, wherever you like. You then send students to the relevant page so that they can vote, and you can collect their responses from a central location. In the question that you saw on the previous slide, I was testing students' grammatical knowledge. I could do that as a pre-test or as a post-test. But there are other kinds of questions you can set up as well. Here is a more general question asking for students' opinions. Again, you could give students this question at the beginning of, let's say, a week, which you're going to spend talking about this topic, or you could give them this question at the end. Even more interestingly, you might give it to them at the beginning and at the end in order to see whether anyone's opinion has shifted. On this screen, you can see the kinds of responses that are possible with MicroPoll. So it's a good way of getting broad overview of what students in a class know or what they think about a particular topic. One of the big pluses from a student point of view is that their responses are anonymously aggregated. So they see the overall results from the class without having to go out on a limb in cases where they may not be very sure of the answer. So it's a really good way of getting large numbers of students involved in responding without putting students on the spot. At this point, you might like to pause this video and go and have a look at the MicroPoll site. In fact, why not take the chance to set up your own polling question? You'll very quickly see how easy it is. Not every polling service requires respondents to answer multiple choice questions of various kinds. There are many services like quick surveys, which you can see here, where it's possible for respondents to send in words, phrases, even whole sentences. You're looking at a poll that I did with a group of Singaporean students in 2011. It was at the end of a course, and I asked each student to name one word or expression they had learnt during the course and which they would now use to talk about the area of e-learning. They worked on desktop computers, laptop computers, and a few of them on mobile devices. I stood at the front of the room with this display next to me on a screen, and as they entered their answers in real time, they appeared on the screen next to me. This was a great way of collecting student responses anonymously, so it wasn't possible to see who had sent in each response, but we very quickly got an overview of what the most popular terms were, and it gave us a good starting point for our discussion. Perhaps you'd like to pause this video again and go and check out quick surveys. Once more, you might like to set up your own example. Another service which has become very popular with educators in recent years, and where you can have both multiple choice and open-ended questions, is Poll Everywhere. You're looking at a survey I did with a group of librarians in Melbourne quite a few years ago. Having covered a number of different tools together, I asked the group which of the tools they thought would be most useful for their work as librarians. The answers appeared in real time on the screen at the front of the room as they entered their responses on their own devices. It pretty quickly emerged that the group considered wikis to be the most useful tool, followed by blogs and so on. So again, this is a great way of getting a snapshot of the views of the people in the room without necessarily putting any one person or any group of people on the spot. Like quick surveys, Poll Everywhere allows respondents to send in full text, so words, phrases, sentences. The poll that you're looking at here was one that I did together with a colleague in a seminar that we ran in Perth in late 2012. We were working together with a group of English teachers, and we asked them how they thought they might use this kind of polling software in their own classes. You can pause the video and have a look at the suggestions that they made on this slide, as well as on subsequent slides. Poll Everywhere also makes it easy to set up multiple choice quizzes based on images. This particular quiz was set up by an early childhood teacher to find out which dinosaur her students preferred amongst the ones that she'd been discussing with them. Or here's another example of a multiple choice quiz based on images and pitched at a rather higher level. This was created by a student on an undergraduate mobile learning course, and it's aimed at other university students. Students can select their response by clicking on the appropriate icon. And here's something different again. This is a quiz question based on a map where students have to answer by clicking on the appropriate countries. This was another one created by a student on the undergraduate mobile learning course, and it's pitched likewise at other university students. Here's Poll Everywhere once again, being used in a rather more sophisticated context. This is a quiz set up by a Perth law lecturer I worked with recently. This is checking her students' understanding of the implications of a particular case. What's really valuable here is that she was able to see not only whether students had understood the implications correctly, but where there were misconceptions, she was able to see how many students shared them and address the most common issues. And so now, if you like, you could pause this video again and go and have a look at the Poll Everywhere software. As I suggested previously with the other polling services, it's worth taking the time to set up a polling question or two of your own to find out how the service works and to see just how easy it is to use. There are also plenty of other polling services you can check out, such as this one, SurveyMonkey, or this one, SurveyNuts. There are now many polling apps available for mobile devices, particularly for smart devices. You'll find ones like this one, eClicker, in the iTunes Store for Apple devices. You'll also find plenty of examples of these types of apps in the Google Play Store for Android devices. There are also increasing numbers of polling services available in both web-based and app formats. Something else to note about the new generation of polling services is that many of them give interesting and useful overviews of student results to teachers. In fact, this is a kind of learning analytics. Here's one example from a teacher who gave her students a quiz about the digestive system both before and after they studied the topic. It's pretty clear from these results that students did improve their knowledge through their study of the digestive system. Socrative 2 allows you to build in a competitive element between teams of students. If you'd like to read this teacher's explanation of how this works, feel free to pause the video. To check out Socrative, feel free to pause the video again and go to the address that you see at the bottom of the screen. Now let's have a look at some interesting variations on the kinds of polling approaches we've been talking about. Mentimeter is a service which combines the idea of polling with the idea of a word cloud. Once again, much as in the quick survey that you saw earlier, I've asked a group of students who've completed an e-learning course to name one word or expression they came across during the course and would now use to talk about the general area of e-learning. Responses which have been nominated by more than one student are shown in larger fonts. So you very quickly get an idea from this word cloud of what the key ideas are that are shared by the largest number of students in the class. Mentimeter is a service you might like to check out yourself. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to do so. A similar service which has become very popular with educators is Answer Garden. Here again, students can send in their responses, but they can also watch their classmates' responses appearing on their own devices in real time. If they agree with a response, they can endorse it by clicking on it, and it will then appear in a larger font. So here we have a democratic representation of everyone's point of view, but we also have a clear indication of the themes on which a group of people agrees. As can be seen in this example of an Answer Garden poll, which I used in a seminar in Singapore towards the end of 2016, it's possible to have quite a large number of respondents. There were 81 people participating in this case. You'll also notice that some people have responded in languages other than English, so Answer Garden can handle multiple languages. Once again, you might like to pause this video and go and check out the Answer Garden service. Clickers represents a different kind of variation on polling. It's a variation in the means of data collection. Students would be given cards and they would select the card that best represents their response to a question posed by the teacher. The teacher would then use an app on a smartphone to scan the classroom, and the responses chosen by the students would be automatically aggregated to produce a visual representation like a bar chart. Another new service worth mentioning is Zeetings. It's a service which is specifically designed to be able to be used on any kind of device, whether, for example, a traditional desktop computer or a mobile device. It's also easy to link Zeetings with a PowerPoint presentation. So keep an eye on this service over the next year or two. Another recent variation on the idea of polling can be seen in a service like Kahoot, which allows teachers to create simple but fun learning games based on multiple choice questions. These are also a way of checking the understanding of students in a class. It's also worth mentioning that we're beginning to see some integration of polling services with wearable devices, like for example the Google Glass augmented reality glasses. This would allow a teacher or a lecturer to see directly in their field of vision the responses coming in from their students to polling questions or quizzes. Whether this would lead to an enhancement of classroom learning or whether it's just a distraction is an open question. What about the dangers of polling then? If you're conducting a poll where people can send in open responses, that is, where they can send in words or phrases or sentences, you might like to start by considering the issue of netiquette. Actually, this is an issue that applies across the web and certainly across Web 2.0, but it's particularly pertinent wherever people are able to respond anonymously, and that can be the case with online polls. If that is the case, you might want to start by talking to a class of students about what kinds of questions, comments, or responses are appropriate, and equally what kinds are not appropriate. Better still, you might ask the members of the class to generate their own list of rules which everyone agrees to abide by. Continuous partial attention is also an issue which is relevant across the web and especially with many Web 2.0 tools. And if you've looked at some of the other videos provided, you may have come across this term before. It was coined by Linda Stone, who argues that nowadays we rarely pay full attention to anyone or anything. Instead, we pay continuous partial attention to a lot of different information and communication channels. And that has real consequences for all sorts of areas of our lives, ranging from personal relationships through to reflective academic thought. This is Linda Stone. She comes from a technology background. She's held some pretty high-powered positions with Apple as a senior researcher and also as a vice president of Microsoft. She is not against technology, but she is arguing that we need to use technology in a balanced way. She's best known for her theory of continuous partial attention, but she does a lot of work in this general space. You might like to take a look at her Wikipedia entry, to look up her website, or to follow her on Twitter. If you'd like to hear an introduction to Linda Stone's concept of continuous partial attention in her own words, pause this video and go to the video that you see at the link at the bottom of the screen. The first half of this short video is all about continuous partial attention. Alright, so pulling all of this together, we can see that polling is great for supporting interactive teaching. It's great for getting students' feedback through their responses, comments, and questions, and ultimately encouraging student-teacher interaction. Polling can also encourage student-student interaction, especially if some students are asking questions and others are making comments through a polling platform. Student-student interaction is also possible when the results of a poll are discussed. On the downside, there may be some netiquette issues, and there could also be issues around continuous partial attention if students are distracted by polls while trying to pay attention to a teacher or a presenter. For a summary of the main points that we've made about polling, as well as links to many of the key polling services, you might like to go to the polling page of the digital learning website. You'll find it at the address at the bottom of the screen.